All right. Hello, this is Christian Idealism, and today I am here with Nevin Climenhaga or Climenhaga. How do you pronounce it?
Climenhaga.
Climenhaga. Okay.
Yeah.
I apologize. I know I asked you before, but kind of. Anyways, so thank you for joining. I really appreciate you coming on because I have been interested in your work for quite some time now, especially on your stuff on probability theory. And so I guess my first question to you, how you doing and what's your areas of research? And so, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me on. Happy to be here. So I work primarily, I would say, in epistemology, philosophy of religion, and philosophy of science. And within philosophy of religion and philosophy of science, I'm especially, though not exclusively, interested in epistemological questions. And one of the main tools that I use for that research, as you suggest, is probability theory. So in my work on probability, I've done work both on the interpretation of probability, how to understand what probability is, and also on applying probability, both to questions in philosophy of religion, like natural theology, how to understand the strength of various natural theological and atheistic arguments, and also to other areas like philosophy of science, like how to understand. So, for example, I have a paper on historical reasoning and how probability theory can inform that. So I'm interested in both the theory of probability and in applying it to various areas.
Right. And so I'm interested in how you got to this point, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Like a mini story, if you want to tell how you got to the point you're at now in terms of your research.
Yeah, so I got interested in probability so I really, not the only, but one of the main areas of interest for me in getting into philosophy was philosophy of religion and epistemology of religion in particular, thinking about questions like, is theistic belief rational and is Christian belief rational? And what I found in exploring those questions is that I needed to ask broader questions about when is belief rational? What ought we believe more generally? How do we tell what we should believe? And that got me interested in these broader epistemological questions. I'm still interested in the religious epistemology questions, and that's a lot of what we'll be talking about today. But I found these general epistemology questions quite interesting for their own sake, and then also found that, it's not just religion where there are hard questions about what we should believe. There's lots of other areas where it's difficult to tell what to believe, where it's difficult to tell what it's rational to think, and where there's a lot of disagreement. And so got interested in applying probability to think about those other areas too. In terms of probability and specifically then, I did a little bit in undergrad, but I did a master's degree. So my undergraduate was at Messiah College, now Messiah University. And Robin Collins, you might know there, was one professor who I worked under. And then in my master's degree, I went to Western Michigan University and took a class on probability theory with Tim McGrew. And that was very influential. That was my first, really getting into the mathematics of probability and seeing how fruitful this could be. And really, since then, I've been developing that, and I found that it's a lens that once I put it on, now it illuminates all these other things that I'm interested in studying.
Yeah, that's interesting because I'm kind of in the same boat myself. I mean, I'm a philosophy student, undergraduate right now.
Okay.
And
At what university?
Yeah, I go to Sac State University, and one of the things is how I started was the questions you were asking, which is how am I rational to hold my beliefs as a Christian, right? And that led me to other questions that just led down me the rabbit hole of philosophy in general, just so many different questions. So yeah, I'm in a similar boat as you in that area, because I find it very interesting. And so
my sense, it's certainly not universally true, but I think it's true for many Christian philosophers that they got into philosophy through thinking about similar kinds of questions.
Yeah, that is true. And so okay, so given your, I guess we'll talk a lot about probability, but how do you define probability in case people don't know what that is? If you don't mind me.
Yeah, so probability is a term that is it's disputed how best to understand it, and it's an interdisciplinary area where you have not only philosophers who try to analyze probability and say what it is, but it's also falls under the domain of mathematics and statistics and is used in physics and the social sciences and so on. So you've got a lot of different people talking about this, a lot of different academics, scholars, and they often talk past each other and often have trouble communicating with each other. Even within philosophy, where there's maybe more disciplinary focus, there is there's this array of different so-called interpretations of probability. So theories about how to understand probability language and theories about what metaphysically probability is. And there's not even really an agreed upon typology of different theories. There are, I think, somewhat common ones, but it's even disputed, like how to best understand the difference between different theories. So rather than try to go through that whole landscape, I'll give you my view, and then we can talk about how it differs from other views if you like. So my own view is that probabilities are relations between propositions. So in particular, while we sometimes just talk about the probability of X, simplicator, like we just say the probability of this coin landing heads is 50%. We always, at least implicitly, have some background in mind where we're saying the probability that this coin lands heads given such and such. And in some cases, we make this explicit. So for example, we might say the probability that the dinosaurs were killed by an asteroid given the scientific evidence is very high. So my view is that all probabilities are conditional in this way. It's always the probability of X given Y. And what the probability of X given Y is it's the degree that Y supports X. Now, that in a way is just restating the idea of probability. So I don't think that the term supports is an analysis in the sense that it like reduces it to something that's easier to grasp, but it's maybe a way of getting us on the path of understanding what probability is. And then I think there are some informative things we can say about this probabilistic support relation. So in particular, I think that support relations, as I'm understanding them, they are mind independent. So they're not just a matter of what we think. And in particular, they're not just a matter of how confident we are in various propositions, which is a different interpretation of probability that tries to analyze probabilities in terms of what our degrees of belief are or our credences, as philosophers say. And so my theory is different from that. It says that the probability of X given Y, it's not the credence that you or anyone else have in X, or the credence that somebody with Y as their evidence has in X. Instead, it's this mind-independent relation between X and Y. If you like, you can think of it as similar to entailment. So whether X entails Y, or I was going the other way, whether Y entails X is a mind-independent fact. It entails it or it doesn't, independent of what anybody thinks. So for example, if Y says this coin lands heads, and X says this coin lands heads or tails, then Y entails X. And that's true no matter what anybody thinks, and whether anybody has even considered the problem. So it's this mind-independent fact. And I think that facts about probability are similar to this, in that the probability that this coin lands heads, given, let's say, that it's symmetrical and that it's flipped randomly in this environment, that probability is 50%, regardless of whether anybody actually does flip the coin or whether anybody thinks about these propositions. It's this mind-independent relation between these two propositions. So it's something that doesn't depend on our degrees of belief. And like facts about entailment, I think facts about probability are necessarily true. So they're true regardless of what other facts are true about the empirical world. They're just these relations, these abstract relations between propositions, like relations of entailment. And they're a priori knowable, in principle at least, like truths of logic or mathematics. And I said that they're not identical to degrees of belief, but I do think they are related to degrees of belief in that if the probability of X given Y is, say, 0.5, then if you have Y as your evidence, you ought to believe X to degree 0.5. Your credence, your degree of confidence in X ought to be 0.5. So degrees of support are not reducible to degrees of belief, but they constrain rational degrees of belief. They tell us what degrees of belief we ought to have.
Okay, so that's interesting because so when you say, and just a quick follow-up question. So like when you say entailment, does that mean that the evidence has to entail certain phenomena, or could you just say that the evidence entails that the probability is going to be higher than without that evidence?
Well, the idea is just an analogy
Okay.
with entailments. So some philosophers who have endorsed similar theories use the metaphor of partial entailment, which I think I'm happy with as well. So if you want, you can think of what we usually call entailment. You can think of it as full entailment, where the proposition that this coin lands heads fully entails that it lands heads or tails. But it may partially entail other propositions. So like say the proposition that this coin lands heads on this toss, and that let's put it this way, that it lands heads on one toss, and that it's been tossed. Well, let's see. Let me do it the other way. So that the proposition that this coin has been tossed 3 times, and that it landed heads one of those 3 times, entails to degree 1/3 that it landed heads this time. Just those two just that conjunctive proposition. It was tossed 3 times and it landed heads 1 out of 3 times.
Okay, so, that makes sense. Yeah.
Right. So it partially entails that it landed heads on this time. It partially entails it to degree 1/3, in something like the same way that if you have full entailment, to make the analogies a little closer, if we had that it landed heads on all 3 tosses, that fully entails that it landed heads on this toss. And if the proposition is it landed heads on 1 out of 3 tosses, then that partially entails to degree 1/3 that it landed heads on this toss. So the idea is you've got this degreed notion, this continuum from 0 to 1. And when we have 1, then that's full entailment. And when we have 0, that's inconsistency. And then other probabilities are these partial entailments in between.
Right. So, and this would apply across any kind of knowledge claim that we make. And so that's kind of like your view, where basically like when we're thinking about, okay, how do I know this or that? Really, and then when I'm talking about, like, let's say if we take an evidentialist view of knowledge or justification, then you would say something like that this evidence increases the probability of this hypothesis, and that how you describe that is through these support relations, right?
Yeah, I think that for any 2 propositions, there is going to be the support relation between them. And some people find that counterintuitive, but I think the reason they find that counterintuitive is because they think that the one proposition has to be relevant to the other in some sense. But that's not necessarily the case. So, for example, let me start with an example of full entailment. So this coin lands heads on 3 out of 3 tosses, and the sky is yellow. Entail, this coin lands heads on the first toss. Now, the second conjunct there was like completely irrelevant, right? Like I could have gotten rid of it and the entailment would still have held. Well, similarly, if you just take 2 propositions which seem like they're totally unrelated, then you might think, well, there's no support relation between the 2 because they just don't have anything to do with each other. But no, I don't think that's right. I think just like you can have like irrelevant things in entailment that don't change the fact that something's entailed. Well, similarly, you can have like irrelevant facts that maybe don't change what the probability would be conditional, like if we didn't have that fact as our background. But the fact that the proposition that the sky is yellow supports this coin lands heads to degree 0.5. I'm happy to say that. But it's just that if you took that proposition away, then the background would already support the proposition this coin lands heads to degree 0.5.
Right. And so that's where, I don't know if you heard, there's this positive relevance view of evidence where E is only evidence if it increases the probability of.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And so I would want to distinguish the supports as the way I'm using it. And here supports is kind of a technical term. Like I'm using it as a name for my theory, and then I'm giving an explication of it. But I don't mean to say that this is like the only pre-theoretic way to use the term supports. So I would want to distinguish that from this notion of evidence for, where I would say that, A is only evidence. I would say that evidence is a three-place relation. A is evidence for B relative to C, where C is like our background information. And A is evidence for B relative to C if it raises the probability of B. That is, if the probability of B given A and C is greater than the probability of B just given C.
Mm-hmm.
And so if A is the sky is yellow and B is this coin lands heads, then A is not going to be evidence for B relative to like normal background condition C.
Right.
But it is still going to have, there's still going to be this degree of support relation. It's just going to be the same as the degree of support relation that we had without A.
Okay, so it seems like to me like this view would apply all across any kind of theory we build about the world. So any scientific theory, any like historical narrative we tell, or stuff like that, would like the same structure would apply. And so I'm wondering, like, is there any time that we can't use probability? So like, I'm not going to mention his name, but like, there's some guy on TikTok that says like we can't use probability to assess the supernatural because the supernatural is not empirical. So like,
right.
What would be? I guess like when is it? When are the times that we can use probability, and what are other times that we can't use probability to assess theories?
So my view is that probability is this fully general notion that always relates to propositions, as we've said. I suspect that the kind of view that you're reacting to here, that you're mentioning, is coming out of a different understanding of probability. So for example, if you understand probabilities in terms of physical chances, as some people do, that like in order to have a probability, you need some natural law with like a random process. And then you have probabilities that fall out of that. Well, then, you're going to think that it doesn't make sense to assign probabilities to like these metaphysical claims, like religious or theistic claims. Or you might think that you might have a frequentist view of probabilities, where you say that probabilities are the frequency of some event in a reference class. And similarly there, so this is a kind of objection that some people make to the fine-tuning argument that, there's only one universe. And so there's no probability that the universe would have particular natural laws, because, to have a probability, you need like an experiment, or you need like a reference class where you have lots of these things. And then you can rerun the experiment, or you can look at a bunch of different cases. And then you take like the ratio of the thing you're interested in that reference class. And so that's a different understanding of probability, which would lead to having a more restrictive view of when it can be used. My view is an unrestricted one. I think that probability is this general notion that always relates to propositions. I have many reasons for not liking those other theories and thinking that this interpretation of probability does better. One brief thing I guess I could say on this specific topic is that an advantage of having a fully general notion of probability is that it lets us apply probability to the question of what we should believe quite generally. So these other kinds of views, like if you have this narrower view, maybe you think it can apply in like some limited ways to questions of scientific confirmation, for example. But then how do you think about the rationality of metaphysical beliefs or of religious beliefs? And that goes for both theism and atheism. Like neither of them are going to be testable, or not testable is the wrong word, but neither of them are going to be rationally explicable in terms of probabilities. And yet when we look at them, it seems that like the laws of probability apply. It seems like if you are 50% confident that God exists, you should be 50% confident that God does not exist, for example. And if you think that, well, that's probability, that the sum of two mutually exclusive propositions, the sum of the probabilities of two mutually exclusive propositions is 100%. So I think that it's natural to think that probability should apply more widely. And it's not just metaphysics or religion, similarly, these kinds of like very strict requirements on when you can apply probability, they often want to apply in other cases, like in historical reasoning, for example. Like, there was only one asteroid that killed the dinosaurs, but it seems like we can rationally say the probability that reasonably say that the probability that the dinosaurs were killed by an asteroid is quite high, and we can like spell out the evidence for that and use Bayes' theorem and so on. And so I think it's hard to do those things if you have a more restricted view of when probability can apply.
Okay, yeah, I like that, because I appreciate your answer on that, because I was just like, it's weird how people throw out this term probability and then they forget about like no one actually agrees on what probability is. There's different views out there, right? And so, like, this leads me to my next question, which is, I know you wrote a paper called "The Structure of Epicenter Probabilities," and you defend a view called explanationism. And so, I guess, what is explanationism, and how does it compare to what you call orthodox Bayesianism? Is like, how do you use those terms? Because I haven't really seen those terms be thrown out in the literature except for your work. So I'm just curious what exactly that view is that you're proposing in that paper, and then, like, what's the general comparison between the two views?
Yeah, that's right. Both of those terms are my own terms that I use in that paper, The Structure of Epistemic Probabilities, because they are useful terms for describing the views that I want to contrast. And that paper is really putting forward, exploring a question that has not been explicitly explored very much in the literature on the philosophy of probability. The terms maybe do connect to some other common usages. So, for example, there are many people who use the term explanationism to mean something like explanation is important for inference, or to refer to people who endorse the idea of inference to the best explanation, which there's this large literature on. And my understanding of explanation, my sense of explanationism in that paper is related to that stuff, in that my view that I defend there is a way of connecting probabilistic reasoning and explanatory reasoning. And in particular, what I argue is that facts about explanatory relations help determine the values of probabilities. And so there's this debate in Bayesian epistemology over whether Bayesianism or probabilistic reasoning is compatible with inference to the best explanation or explanatory reasoning. And so I think it is. And so my view can be seen in context of that literature as one way of developing a view that incorporates both explanatory considerations and probabilistic considerations. And in particular, I think that explanatory considerations help determine what the values of probabilities are. So to go a bit more in depth then, so explanationism and orthodoxy are both, as I define them, are both answers to the question of what the basic probabilities are. So there's this question, which, as I said, has not really been discussed much in the literature, about the dependence relations that hold between different probabilities. So it's this question about the metaphysical structure of degrees of support on my understanding of probabilities. Some probabilities depend for their values on other probabilities. Their values are grounded in the values of other probabilities. So, for example, it's natural to think that the probability that I toss a coin, given that I toss a coin 100 times, the probability that it lands heads 53 of those times is grounded, is dependent on the probability that it lands heads, like on individual tosses. And the way to calculate it out is, you'd like multiply the probabilities of different possible outcomes, and then you've got this complicated equation, and then that tells you what the probability that it lands heads on 53 of the 100 tosses is. To make it a little bit simpler, let's say not any 53, but say like the first 53, like 53, and then the first 53 are heads and the last 47 are tails. So then you would just multiply, like 1/2 for each of them, and it'd be like 1/2 to the power of 100. So it's natural to think that the probability of that big conjunctive string of tosses is determined by the probabilities of each individual toss, and they're each 1/2, and so it's a simple calculation. If it was like rolling a die, then it'd be a little more complicated. So that's a case where this would be predicted by my own theory, but I think it's independently plausible that the probability of this complex proposition is determined by the probabilities of these individual propositions, which you just then multiply. Now, in that case, these are independent events, and it's a very simple case. But my general account then says that here are the basic probabilities, that is, the probabilities that are not determined by the values of other probabilities. And then here's how we get from those to other probabilities. The basic probabilities are the probabilities of atomic propositions, so not a conjunction or a disjunction or some logical combination, but atomic propositions where you can't decompose it anymore. The probabilities of atomic propositions conditional on potential direct explanations of that proposition, or potential on direct influences, things that make a difference to whether that proposition is true, where there's like nothing else in between those two things that like mediates that influence. So there are influences and the direct influences. So for example, the probability that I draw a black marble out of this bag, given that it has 2 black marbles and 1 white marble. So there, the background tells you like everything that influences whether I draw a black marble. And then you can see, oh, that probability is 2/3. So that's an example of a basic probability. And then those basic probabilities, they determine the values of all other probabilities on this explanationist view. So we start by coming up with a structure of the relation between different variables, which are like particular questions we might ask about the world, like what's in this bag, what do I draw out of the bag, and so on. And then there are different propositions that can be true for those variables. And so we have this explanatory network, this graph relating all these variables, and then the probability, the like graph theoretic way that we do it is that the probability of a variable conditional on its parents in the graph. That's a basic probability. And then we assume what's called the Markov condition, which says that the probability of a variable of a node on the graph conditional on any non-descendants. Let me get this right. Right, that if so the probability, if we have the probability of a variable conditional on its parents, then we can't change that probability except by conditioning on its descendants. That's one way to put it. So an informal way to put it is that you can only get information about a variable once you know its causes or its explanations. You can only get information about it by learning about its effects. So for example, if you know that the only thing that makes a difference to whether I develop lung cancer is how much tar is in my lungs, then learning that I smoke does not change the probability that I got lung cancer, because you know that the only way that smoking makes a difference is through how much tar is in my lungs. But learning that I have this really bad cough, or that I have shortness of breath, or things like these could be evidence for lung cancer, because these could be effects of lung cancer. So that's a substantive condition that you need to assume, but it's plausible. And then if you assume that, then you can derive all other probabilities once you have these basic probabilities in this explanationist system. So that's explanationism. And then there's orthodoxy, which I contrasted to. Orthodoxy says that you start with state descriptions, which are complete descriptions of a way the world might be. And then you take the unconditional probabilities of those, and then you can derive all other probabilities from those. And I'll let you follow up in a sec, because there's probably a lot we can get into here. Mathematically, both work. That is to say that mathematically, if you start with either of these, either the explanationist basic probabilities or the orthodox basic probabilities, then you can derive all other probabilities. But then there's the question of which one is plausible. Which one is it plausible to say these ones are basic and then others are determined by them? And I think the explanationist one is more plausible. And just briefly, I call the orthodox one orthodoxy just because it's not like strictly implied by the standard mathematical axiomatization of probability, but the way that axiomatization is often developed and talked about makes it very natural to think that the way that we should assign probabilities is by starting with these complete descriptions of the world, these state descriptions, and then assigning probabilities to those and deriving others from them. So that's why I call it orthodoxy.
Right. So I was going to ask a question about intrinsic probability, but it seems like you answered that question already.
Okay.
In terms of, because it seems like explanationism would say something like, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but like, the intrinsic probability is basically all conditional, and then an intrinsic probability in orthodox Bayesianism would be unconditional. So right there's a difference, and then specifically intrinsic probability would be conditional on potential direct explanations, right? Am I getting that right?
So the term that I use is basic probability. And again, this is not one that's really used elsewhere in the literature, because people haven't really been asking this question. The term intrinsic probability is one that is used by some in the literature. It's maybe especially common in philosophy of religion. And I think people just use it to mean unconditional, like the intrinsic probability of a proposition is the unconditional probability of that proposition, which on my theory of probability, the way I would understand that is it's probability conditional only on a priori truths. So like so anything that always had probability 1, like the fact that 2 + 2 = 4, all that stuff is like, that's part of our conditions, but not anything else.
This leads me to my question about simplicity, which is like, it seems like, okay, so I guess what would be simplicity on your view, and then like, I know you wrote a paper specifically on simplicity, so like, are simpler worlds more probable? And I'm just curious, like, what is simplicity on explanationism, and then how does that connect to the explanationist framework of probability? Like, I'm just, because like I see a lot of, and I'll mention some like philosophers in a moment that kind of argue for naturalism on this line of reasoning, but like I'm just curious because like at least online I see people say something like atheism is more simple because you have just the natural world, and theism is the natural world plus God, something like that. And then you have more sophisticated arguments like Graham Oppy's arguments for the simplicity of naturalism, where at least given his most recent work, he argues like the axioms of his worldview are less than the theist has. And then you have Paul Draper, which argues that, he partitions out the unconditional probabilities in a way where you have, naturalism, supernaturalism, but then you have theism as a subset, and you have personal theism as another subset. And so then, like, logically, according to him, like, naturalism is more intrinsically probable than theism because of that. So I'm just curious, like I know those are like 3 different ways of thinking about it, but it does relate to like this question about like is the simplest worldview. Seems like the simplest worldview is not always the most plausible. Like, I'm just curious. Why that?
So
that would be the case.
The way that my explanationist theory relates to this is that. So that theory, recall, is a theory of the dependence relations that hold between different probabilities. And I said the non-basic probabilities, the ones that you can derive from the basic ones, well, they're determined by the basic ones. And so their values are just determined by math. And so asking questions like how simple is like this proposition in that probability, that's not going to be directly relevant. If it's relevant, it can only be relevant indirectly, because like to determine the probability that this coin lands heads 100 times, or that the first 53 times and then tails the rest, the 47, well, you just have to calculate it, right? You don't have to, like look at the simplicity of that overall of that, big conjunctive proposition. You just have to calculate it in terms of these more basic probabilities. And so then what that implies is that if a factor like simplicity is relevant, it has to be relevant to the basic probabilities, because those are the ones where there's room for non-mathematical factors to enter into determining their values. And that's where we need like some non-mathematical criteria like simplicity or the principle of indifference or something to tell us how to assign those probabilities. And I would say that those two, simplicity and indifference, are really the big 2 that have been proposed. So so my view says that saying that simpler worldviews in the sense of like state descriptions or like complete descriptions of the world, those are not going to always be more probable. And I have some other independent arguments for that, which we can maybe get into, or we can skip over if we're because I know we want to get to some other things. But that on my view, I would say that's not always going to be the case. Instead, if simplicity is relevant, what we need to be looking at is the probability. We need to be comparing probabilities of propositions on the same level of explanation, conditional on potential direct explanations. And then when we're doing that more narrow comparison, then simplicity might be relevant. Maybe it's helpful to say, just as kind of a way getting into this, I think you need to have some theory about when simplicity applies, because an unrestricted simplicity principle just can't possibly be right. Like you immediately would end up in mathematical contradictions. So for example, the proposition A is simpler than the proposition A or B, right?
Yep.
At least in the sense that it can be stated more simply. But necessarily, A or B is at least as probable as A. And if you assume that the probability of B is not zero, then wait, do I have this right? Probability of A. Yeah, if you assume the probability of B is not zero, then the probability of A or B is going to be, and no, you assume that A does not, that B does not entail A. That's what you need to assume. If you assume that B does not entail A, then the probability of A or B is going to be higher than the probability of A, even though it's less simple.
Hey, Nevin,
So,
I think I think you broke up a little bit, but you're talking about how you have A and an A or B. So as long as B is non-zero, then A or B is going to be more probable than A, at least if we're doing the math, right?
Yeah. So A or B is usually going to be more probable than A.
Yeah.
Even though it's a less simple proposition. So you can't have this unrestricted simplicity principle where you just say, like, in general, simpler propositions are more probable. That's a non-starter.
So what you're saying basically is, like, simplicity can be used to judge the probability, but it's not going to be like, you're going to have to restrict it to like fundamental simplicity. Or I guess another way of saying is, like, if you want to argue that the simpler worldview is more probable, you can do that, but you're going to have to filter it through the lenses of explanationism before you could, like, you just can't say, naturalism just posits the natural world, theism is not the natural world plus God, therefore naturalism is more probable. Like, that doesn't logically follow. Just because atheism may be more simple on the total number of things that it posits, like in its description, like in its overall state description, that doesn't mean that it's more probable. Right.
Yeah. So what I'm saying, so really there's a two-step argument here. So first, you can't have an unrestricted simplicity principle where you just say, like, simpler propositions are always more probable than less simple propositions. Very simple cases will show that just as a matter of logic, that can't be right. And so there needs to be some restriction on when this simplicity principle applies. And I maybe won't go through the argument for this, but I think that the only two ways that it can consistently apply are either to go with this orthodoxy view and say that state descriptions, that we favor simpler state descriptions, which is like simpler possible worlds, basically. And that, I think, is a mathematically consistent way to develop it. And that is maybe, some people who run this line that, an atheistic worldview in like the total world ends up simpler than on a theistic worldview. That would maybe be a way of applying that. And then the other way is this explanationist view. And the way that I would apply it there is to say, we start with theories of fundamental reality. So these explanatorily ultimate propositions where there's nothing contingent or empirical that's explanatorily prior to them. And then these theories of ultimate reality, how simple are they? And then you favor the simpler ones there. And then once you have those, then you have like probabilities conditional on those for how explanatorily downstream parts of the world are. And you multiply through all that, and then you end up with a state description, a total description of the world. And so you can get like either probabilities out of the other. But in this case, we're not saying that we're going after a simpler total description of the world. We're saying we're going for a simpler description of the fundamental part of the world, and then looking at what that implies for the rest of the world. So that's the contrast.
So that's interesting. So there are two philosophers in particular. Well, actually, technically three, I guess. So there's what's his name? There's this guy. Okay, you might get the name better than I can, but there's this philosopher that has argued for what's called Occam's laser.
Yeah,
I believe
Jonathan Schaeffer.
Okay, Jonathan. Yeah, that's what I was. So Jonathan Schaeffer. So you have that view, which says like we should only count the number of fundamental entities, and then you have Joshua Sijuwati's kind of argument that theism is more simple because it only posits like one trope or something, so it's just an application of that. And then you have Swinburne, which argues along similar lines of reasoning, although he doesn't hold to trope theory, but he does kind of argue along similar lines where when we count the number of fundamental entities, that theism is simpler. And so would you say that like your view of explanationism is basically just like an application of like Schaffer's Occam's laser and like maybe Sijuwati's extension of that idea?
Yeah, they're certainly related. I would put it the other way around. I would say that Schaeffer's view. I mean, I don't think Schaeffer. Well, that paper was before mine. But
Yeah.
I don't think he knows my view. But I would say that it's an application of my explanationist theory. Or to put it another way, I would say that my explanationist theory gives a more general framework from which Occam's laser, the idea that we should prefer the simplest theory of the fundamental, that falls out of, that's implied by my explanationist theory. So my explanationist theory is like a generalization. It gives a fuller account that implies it. I don't know Sichawati's view, but I think that it would be one way of pressing this argument.
Well, Sichawati, he takes Schaeffer's view and just applies it to his model of theism. So
okay,
that's why I mentioned.
Okay, yeah. Who was the third person you mentioned?
Richard Swinburne.
Oh, right. Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
And Swinburne's general approach is very much in keeping with my explanationist theory. I think that in the methodology that he practices, I think it's basically right. And he said some similar things to what I say. I think he just never develops it quite as rigorously. And he also says some things that I think are inconsistent with it. But I think that he's in some of his theoretical work.
And I know you already talked to him about that, so we don't need to go there.
I talked to Tim Howard about that in our interview.
Yeah. But okay, because there's this whole debate online that naturalism is simpler, theism is simpler, but it seems like, to me at least, these debates just come down to what view of probability do you prefer.
Yeah.
So if you prefer an explanationist view, then theism is going to be more simple, whereas if you prefer some orthodox view, then naturalism might be simpler. I don't know, that just seems to me what it boils down to.
I don't think I would put it quite that starkly. I think there's still a substantive question about, if you take the explanationist view, about the relative simplicity of theism and naturalism, or particular versions of naturalism. And so here, like you mentioned, Draper and Oppie, and I think that Draper in particular, I think that his arguments are worth taking seriously here. That it's interesting because I think he has a theory of what determines intrinsic probabilities, and I think that theory is wrong. And we can get into it if you like, but he thinks it's a function of coherence and modesty of propositions. I think that he states this as a fully general theory, and I think it runs into problems for the same reason that a fully general theory of simplicity runs into problems. You need to restrict it in some way, and he doesn't do that. At least not explicitly. And so I think when he tackles these questions at a more theoretical level, then I don't think that his theory is right. But when he actually talks about this applied question of the probability of theism versus naturalism, I think the way that he approaches it is pretty plausible. And you can question the particular moves that he makes, but I think the general structure of his reasoning is good, in that he starts by trying to divide up the space of possibilities into equally possible alternatives, equally probable alternatives, source idealism and source physicalism. So the idea that the ultimate explanation is mental versus the ultimate explanation is physical. He says these are equally intrinsically plausible, and even if you don't buy his particular theory of intrinsic plausibility, that's kind of plausible that these two start out with equal probability. And then he says theism is a particular specific version of the source idealist view. And because it's so specific, then it's going to be have a fairly low intrinsic probability, unconditional probability, before you look at the evidence. And again, I think maybe that step is where I would challenge a little bit more. I think that theism is pretty simple, and these different properties that it ascribes to God, some of them may be mutually entailing. And so I think that maybe he overstates just how improbable it's going to be. But the general structure of that reasoning, I find plausible.
Yeah, so you don't question the structure, you more question the specific details.
The specific details, yeah.
Yeah. I don't want to get too much into Draper, but just curious about that.
I might have you send me I don't think I've read the most recent thing by Oppie you mentioned, where he looks at the axioms of each theory.
Yeah, that's kind of more complicated.
Yeah.
I'd have to. Yeah, and I think it's this book right here where gets into the specifics on that
Oh, okay.
point.
Oh,
But
okay.
yeah,
His book with Pierce. Yeah, I haven't read that.
yeah,
Yeah, other things that he says, sometimes he says this like worldview thing where it sounds like he's talking about the total world, and
yep,
then that sounds like the state description view, which, as I've said, I think is not right.
hmm
Other times he says that that naturalism posits fewer fundamental things, and that sounds a lot closer to my view. But then when he
yeah,
goes on to defend that, it seems like he only has metaphysical fundamentality in mind. So
yeah,
he seems to think that, like, well, the universe is metaphysically fundamental, and I don't know, like fields and particles, like things that are in our best theory of physics, those are metaphysically fundamental. They're not grounded. Their existence isn't grounded in something else. No, I'm not even sure if the theist has to accept that. Like
yeah,
certain theistic idealist views wouldn't accept that. I probably do accept it, but I think that you need to not only look at metaphysical fundamentality, also at causal fundamentality. And even if
right,
like the universe and the fundamental physical things are metaphysically fundamental, well, they're not causally fundamental, or they don't have to be. There could be something that's causally prior to the universe, and theism says there is, and theism says those things are not causally fundamental. And so I think that if you are looking at the simplicity of the fundamental things in both metaphysical and causal, so like both of these kinds of explanatory fundamentality, then theism, then it's an open question whether theism or naturalism is simpler, and so you need to do some further argumentation. So I think that at least
right.
the argumentation of Oppius that I've seen along those lines, I think, doesn't work for that reason.
Yeah, this is an offset question. I know I said an hour, but you're willing to go over?
Yeah,
Like,
I'm happy to go. I'm happy to go longer if you're able to.
okay, yeah. Just because I didn't, I was hoping we can get to this the later sections, but unfortunately, oh well, it is what it is. So now this gets into. I'll skip the miracle question for now. I'll wait for that until the end. But okay, so recently there's been this kind of, I guess, development or realization that theistic prediction works in this sort of way where you have theism and then some kind of what's called axiology, which is a theory of value. And so because God is always going to act towards value, then whatever that value is, the value theory you're using to describe, then theism is just when you can join the two together, that you're going to get theistic predictions that way. And that kind of is a kind of extension of your own work, because I know you've argued that like Darwin's theory requires like auxiliary hypotheses in order to make predictions. And so like I'm curious what your thoughts are in that. So like, is it the case that at least in science, like theories don't make predictions on their own? Typically they're going to need some kind of auxiliary hypothesis to like make specific predictions. What's your thoughts on that point?
Yeah, I think so. I give the example of Darwinism and how to understand the structural reasoning about it in my explanationism paper, the structure of epistemic probabilities. Yeah, and I think I don't know if I would want to make a universal claim. I haven't thought about it, but it certainly is a generally true claim. Scientific theories, the probability of an observation given a scientific theory is not going to be basic. It's going to be the probability of that observation given the scientific theory and various auxiliary hypotheses, like for example about our experimental setup and other relevant background information that makes a difference to how likely it is that we would make this observation. And I think that view, it's not put in that way in terms of basic probability, but that's a pretty standard view in the philosophy of science, in that going back to debates like about Popper's falsificationism and so on. Yep. This point has been made that theories make predictions in conjunction with these auxiliary hypotheses about other relevant things. So, for example, if you think about like back in the early days of the scientific revolution, there were debates about geocentrism versus heliocentrism. Is the Earth at the center of the universe or the sun at the center of the universe? And there were, these theories make different predictions. But you have to have auxiliary hypotheses about, for example, how telescopes work and whether the laws of physics are different in the heavens or in, below the heavenly sphere and above the heavenly sphere, and these kinds of things. And what you say about those things will make a difference to what predictions you make about what's going to happen when you look through your telescope.
Or like the external world exists, or that the laws of nature are uniform, stuff like that as well? Are those? I'm just curious because like.
Yeah, well, the external world exists might be
Yeah.
required for either hypothesis, but
Right.
yeah, like the uniformity of laws of nature, sure, that's something that could make a difference to what theories predict.
Okay, yeah. So it's interesting because there's the Dean-Hem-Quinn thesis, I believe. I don't know if I pronounced it right, but it's this idea of like you can just generate an infinite number of auxiliary hypotheses, and so you can't falsify anything. But it seems
Right.
like, so is it the case that like, okay, yeah, that might be true, but like we can use Bayesian confirmation theory to like actually calculate the probability of these auxiliary hypotheses, and so you don't run into
Yeah.
that problem.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. So if you think of it in this like binary sense of, oh, we want to like falsify these theories, or we want to like confirm them by finding a prediction that they entail, which was this so-called hypothetical deductive model of confirmation that was popular in the early 20th century. Well, those theories don't work because partly, I mean, for multiple reasons, but partly because of this problem of auxiliary hypotheses. That if, so with falsificationism, for example, if you find something that seems to disconfirm your theory, well, it could be that your theory is wrong, or it could be that like your equipment wasn't working properly, right? Or that some auxiliary hypothesis about how things work is wrong. And if you're looking for certainty, no, you can't tell which one of those is wrong. But if you just assign probabilities to the scientific theory and its rivals and to these various auxiliary hypotheses, then you can look at the conjunction of all of them, and those conjunctions will be confirmed or disconfirmed because they will imply particular probabilities. On my theory, as I've said, this would be like a basic probability of this observation given, these the conjunction of like these relevant background factors, and then different conjunctions will be confirmed or disconfirmed. So when we see an observation that, like I look through my telescope and I see that Jupiter seems to have moons, well, that disconfirms the conjunction of geocentrism and telescopes work in the way that like our that contemporary optics say they work. But maybe it doesn't disconfirm geocentrism and this other like ad hoc theory about how telescopes work. But that ad hoc theory, maybe it's not very plausible, or maybe we have other evidence against it, and so we disconfirm that some other way. So yeah, when you bring in these auxiliary hypotheses, then I think we can again say some substantive things about confirmation and disconfirmation, but we had to bring in probabilities to do so.
Okay, so this brings us to my next question. This is relevant, I think, for how theistic explanations work. So do you think it's methodologically sound to like have theism and then have some assumptions about value with a assuming that they have a non-zero probability? Then given those two, you have theism as your metaphysical theory, you have axiology as your value theory. And so because God is always going to act towards value, then whatever your value theory says is just going to be the case. So God will actualize or act towards whatever is valuable, right? And so, like, do you think that kind of way of modeling it, do you think that has like applications for like natural theology and how theism can make predictions? Like we can just consistently do this throughout all theistic confirmation?
Yeah, I think that's broadly right. Did you have more you were gonna?
No. I was just curious what your thoughts were on that, because I haven't seen any philosophers do that.
Yeah, I don't. So I think on the problem of evil, maybe there's some people who have made similar suggestions, but not in quite as rigorous terms. Like Paul Draper in his paper Pain and Pleasure, and maybe William Alston in one of his early papers defending a kind of skeptical theism. He makes this point that like you have all these different possible stories, and when you have like a bunch of possible stories, and then maybe that makes it more probable that there would be evil. So there's people who say some things that I think are coming out of similar ideas, but maybe they have been made explicit. So yeah, in the way that you put it in terms of axiologies or moral theories, these would, on my view, these are helpful to bring in because, so we've got, let's look at like the fundamental, or the like original state of the universe with these physical laws and these original, this original distribution of matter and energy and so on. So the probability of that state is going to be the basic probabilities there are going to be the probability of that state given potential direct influences on what on the fact that the universe exists at all and that it has these characteristics. And one possible theory is that the universe is brute, so there's no explanation. Another possible explanation is that it's the result of is it part of a multiverse? It's maybe generates universes periodically, something like that. Another possible explanation is that the universe was created by God. And there are other possible explanations as well. So we don't have to go through all the possibilities. But relative to the possibility that the universe was created by God, well, what the moral facts are is going to make a difference to how probable it is that God would create this universe and that it would be, this way. Because God is a being who is morally perfect, and so who's going to be responsive to the moral facts in what he does. And so at least, so the moral facts are going to be one of the explanatorily prior facts that it's going to be relevant, that we're going to need to think about these probabilities relative to. And when we conjoin, so they're going to be like auxiliary hypotheses, to draw an analogy with what we were just talking about. Now, when conjoined with like these particular versions of naturalism, they're not going to make any difference. But when conjoined with theism, for example, then they are going to make a difference in that they will make different predictions about what God would do. So, for example, to give like simple examples, if you had, say, a really like a moral theory that said it's always bad for life to exist, like maybe some really strong forms of antinatalism are like this. Like they say that like suffering is just so bad, like all life involves suffering, and suffering is just so bad that it can't be outweighed by other factors. So it's always bad for life to exist. Well, that theory would predict that would make it unlikely that God would create a universe with physical laws that could sustain life, which our universe is one. You contrast that with a moral theory that says that life is good on the whole, or that implies that life is good on the whole. Well, that moral theory is going to make it more likely that God would create a universe like this one. And so, yes, I think that that a good way to start is to say, what are these different possible moral theories? How plausible are they? And then you can join theism with each of them and see what predictions those make. I think the only other thing I would say that would be a slight amendment of the way you put it in asking this question is that I don't think that the moral theory conjoined with theism is necessarily going to entail that God would do a particular thing. I think often we're going to be left with probabilities. One reason for that is that many moral theories will leave many equally choice-worthy options on the table. So even like a very simple utilitarianism that says that like pleasure is the only good, and that that we should always maximize expected utility in the sense of like expected total pleasure. Like even that very simple theory, there might be many possibilities that like have equal amounts of pleasure. And when you make things more complicated and you say, well, there's not just pleasure, there's multiple goods, and maybe these are not commensurable, then you might end up with many different possible courses of action. I mean, in God's case, we can even assume that like God knows exactly what's going to happen if he does something. So there's not this uncertainty that we face about the consequences of his actions. Even if we assume that, there might be incommensurability of different options in terms of value, or equality of value for different options. So even if like God's consequentialist and doesn't have uncertainty, there's still going to be multiple possible options that might be left open. And so then, you might want to do things like say, well, they're all equally probable, for example, or maybe you think, that the simpler ones are more probable or something. But I think that you're going to get different probabilities from naturalism. So I think theism is going to make predictions, but it's not necessarily going to be the case that a particular action is going to be entailed. There might still be multiple ones that are left open.
And that's just because like the probability of the moral, like if I say human life is a good, and like that's like a 50% probable, then that just means that God has a 50% probability of him doing that particular.
Well, I guess probabilities enter in two ways.
Yeah.
So the one is the probability of the axiology, as you're putting it, and the second is the probability of God performing some action conditional on that axiology being correct. And I think that both of these can have probabilities between 0 and 1. They can be like these intermediate probabilities. And the former comes because of this intrinsic uncertainty about what moral theory is correct. The latter comes in because it could be that even conditional on a moral theory, that moral theory leaves open multiple equally choice-worthy options for God.
But regardless,
maybe then they're all equally probable.
But the point is, like, regardless, theism would still make predictions in either case. It just might not be.
Yes.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
And so, like, I guess this might seem like a weird question, but like, how would one even go about to calculate the probability of some axiology? Would it just be dependent upon like what arguments you bring forth, or I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I think that if we're talking about the unconditional probabilities, so before we look at particular empirical evidences, then we're mostly going to be relying on our intuitions, and and the kinds of philosophical arguments that people give for different moral theories, and things like simplicity might play a role here.
Yeah.
Like one argument for consequentialism is it's a very simple theory, right? And it only has this one fundamental normative principle. So I think those are going to be those like standard arguments in normative ethics are going to be the starting point for assigning probabilities. And then those initial probabilities are going to be what combine with the initial probabilities of theism and other theories of ultimate origins in order to make empirical predictions. Now, once we have that, then the empirical observations we make of the kind of universe we live in and so on, then they may change the probability of those moral theories, at least if theism or other theories where the moral facts make a difference end up being well confirmed. So, for example, so it's just like the scientific case where you have like the conjunction of the scientific theory with the auxiliary hypothesis. So here, we have theism conjoined with the axiologies. And so, for example, the fact that life exists is evidence for the conjunction of theism and life is good. And so it's evidence against the conjunction of theism and, the strong antinatalism theory that says that, like, life is suffering and no life is never on balance good.
Yeah. That's interesting because, so would you say that, like, if we say that, like, okay, I want to bring up fine tuning because I know you mentioned this in your discussion with Tim. So you think that fine tuning actually outweighs, like, can outweigh evil, for example. So I'm curious, would you say that like a beautiful universe and like life in general is such a good thing that there's such a high probability to that being a good thing that God will actualize it, and so then that's why the fine-tuning argument would be like that much powerful of an argument that would kind of outweigh like any kind of bad states of affairs that could be against theism. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say it would outweigh any bad states of affairs.
Okay. But at least the ones we observe.
Yeah, the ones we observe. Yeah. So I think that the arguments. So to give a little bit of background, I think the fine-tuning argument is a good argument. I think that it significantly raises the probability of theism. I think that the argument for evil, for atheism, I think that there are some plausible theodicies and some things that we can say, but I think it's an argument worth taking seriously, and that it does, I think, lower the probability of theism. And so I think the cavalier attitude that some theists take towards it, or the attitude where they want to say it's no evidence, I think that's too strong. I don't think that's right. But I think that when we try to balance these arguments against each other, and incidentally, one nice thing about approaching these natural theological and atheological arguments probabilistically is that this gives us a framework for doing this. It gives us a framework for asking what's the cumulative force of these different arguments? How do they combine together? I think when we do that, in the case of fine-tuning and evil, that it's plausible that the evidence of fine-tuning significantly outweighs the evidence of evil. One reason for that is in kind of the structure of the arguments, that the fine-tuning argument gets its force not so much from it being probable that God would create a life-sustaining universe like this one, but from it being so extraordinarily improbable that a life-sustaining universe like this one would exist if God does not exist. And so in particular, I won't go through like all of the math, but the degree to which a piece of evidence raises the probability of one hypothesis over a rival is a function of what's called the Bayes factor, which is the probability of the evidence given hypothesis 1 over the probability of the evidence given hypothesis 2. And so it's a ratio. And in the case of theism versus naturalism, at least single universe naturalism in the multiverse is a messy issue, which maybe we want to set aside for the sake of simplicity here. In theism versus single universe naturalism, the probability of a fine-tuned universe given theism doesn't have to be especially high. Maybe you think like that life is suffering theory. Maybe you think that's pretty plausible antecedently. But you probably don't think the probability. You probably think that the probability of a moral theory on which life is fundamentally good and like it'd be a good thing for God to create life. Maybe that's 1%. Maybe it's 1 in 10,000. I think that's being very generous to the skeptic here. But even if we say that, the probability, if you buy like the fine-tuning argument and the way that it goes about calculating probabilities for a fine-tuned universe on single universe naturalism, well, the idea is that the space of possible ways of spelling out the laws of nature on which the universe allows for life is this minuscule fraction of the space of total possible configurations of the laws of nature. And this is a plausible case where if the universe is not designed and if it's not like produced by some process, that we should be indifferent over all these possible ways of spelling out the laws of nature. And so the probability you're going to end up with for a fine-tuned universe on single universe naturalism is going to be like extraordinarily low. It's going to be like 1 in 10 to the 10 to the 100, these kinds of numbers. There's some uncertainty in those exact numbers, right? So, we shouldn't be confident in exact numbers there, but it's going to be extremely low. And so what you're going to get is that even if the probability of a fine-tuned universe given theism isn't especially high, it's still, like 10 to the 100 or 10 to the 10 to the 100 times more likely given theism than given naturalism.
Right. And so would that even answer, like, I know there's the electrons in love objection, but like I feel like even if you apply that objection to the fine-tuning argument, it still seems like you're going to get a very high confirmation.
That's right. Yeah. So yeah, exactly. So this would be like an auxiliary hypothesis. So yeah, this is totally blanking on the philosopher's name right now. But the objection is that like, well, God can do anything. It's possible that God could, make this very simple universe that has consciousness. And so then we need like this auxiliary hypothesis that maybe that consciousness is only possible with a certain degree of complexity, or maybe that there's something else good about the kinds of interactions that complex life allows. Maybe you think these auxiliary hypotheses start out with a low probability, like 1% or 1 in 10,000. Fine. Still, what you're going to do is you're going to like multiply the probability of those auxiliary hypotheses by the probability of God acting in this way conditional on those auxiliary hypotheses. And maybe you think the latter, or maybe we say that it's 1 in 10,000, and then we say, oh, electrons in love objection. So really, we need to multiply that 1 in 10,000 by another 1 in 10,000. Okay. Well, then, we've got, what's 10,000? So there are 4 zeros. So, now we're like 1 in 10 to the 8 instead of 1 in 10 to the 4. But still, this is like many, 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 many orders of magnitude higher than the probability of a universe with life on single universe naturalism. So yeah, I think that it does apply to that argument too. So then to bring it back to evil, then when we're looking at the evidence of evil, then the argument is that evil is more likely on naturalism than on theism. And there, I think it's pretty plausible that, and so by the way, we need to take the existence of a life-permitting universe as our background here, and that's legitimate. That's the way that we do it when we multiply through multiple evidences. So we've already taken into account the fact that our universe is fine-tuned for life, and now we're taking into account the fact that our universe contains the kinds of suffering and evil that we observe. I think that fact is very probable on naturalism, conditional on our universe being finely tuned for life, on it allowing for life. So I think that pain and suffering is very highly predicted by naturalism. And I think it plausibly is less well predicted by theism, but I don't think that you're going to get the probability of it on theism being, these numbers like 1 in 10 to the 100.
Right, especially if you have some theodicy in the background.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
If there's some theodicy that has like a 1% probability, then that's all you need. And then, the probability of the kind of pain and suffering we observe is maybe it's not 1%, depending, maybe the theodicy doesn't exactly predict it, but it's going to be on that order of magnitude. And so I don't think we're going to get the base factor for evil I don't think we're going to get the evils we observe being as many times more probable given naturalism than theism, as we are going to have fine-tuning be that so many times more probable given theism than naturalism.
Okay, just one quick side question. Have you read Robert Bass's paper on many inscrutable evils, or no?
No.
Okay, I won't ask you a question about that then, because
Neil Sinababu, that's the philosopher who wrote the electrons.
The electrons. Yeah, I was just curious about the Robert Bass paper.
No, I haven't read that.
Okay, then I won't ask you a question about that, because he argues that evil outweighs everything. But if you haven't read the paper, then there's no point asking you about it. So I have one final question, which is, I guess this is like kind of like an objection that people bring up. So like an objection to theistic explanation is that we can't probability God, because we cannot calculate the truth of any axiology. So even if we say like there's a probability of 1 that God would do a best action, like we can't say what that best action is going to be, because we can't calculate the probability of any axiology, at least to any relatively high degree. And so I guess the point here is like there's a very, very low probability that God would do any particular action or actualize any particular state of affairs. And so like how would you respond to that kind of objection given your views of probability?
Yeah, I think maybe there are 2 different worries there. So one is that any particular action is going to be improbable because it's going to be so specific, any particular action of God's. And so then how do we work with that? And then the other is that these axiologies, these moral theories that make a difference to what theism predicts, that we can't tell how probable they are. So let me try to take those worries in turn. So with the first one, so think again about the probability of different configurations of the physical laws. So in particular, think about the probability of different physical constants given the existence of a universe with the physical laws that ours has, with parameters that can take on different values, like the strength of gravity or the mass of the electron and so on. The space of possibilities here for what kind of a universe God could create is quite large. And so, plausibly, any particular specification of these values is going to be improbable given theism. But the same is true on naturalism. The space of possibilities is just as large on naturalism. And the important point is just that the probabilities are different. So on theism, we have like these moral theories that might make a difference to what God would do and which life is valuable. And, maybe conditional on those, then we assign equal probability. Well, maybe, we assign a certain probability of God creating a life-sustaining universe at all. And then conditional on that, we assign an equal probability over the different ways that the values could be that allow for life. And then on naturalism, we assign an equal probability over the total possible range of values. And once we do that, then the probability of the values falling in this range of life, of the probability of the values being precisely what they are, rather, which is in this life permitting range, will be much higher given theism than naturalism. The probability would be extremely low on both theories, but it will be higher. It will be many times higher on theism than naturalism. And it's those comparative probabilities that matter, as I was talking about a minute ago with the base factors. So I think that like the specificity is not going to be a big problem here. The ranges are infinite, and so maybe the probability of like any particular thing, or some ranges are maybe infinite, so maybe the probability of a particular thing is 0, but I think we can still have comparative probabilities, or maybe they're infinitesimal probabilities, but I think we can still have comparative probabilities even in those cases. But that's an aside that I think we don't need to get into. the other worry was the probabilities of axiologies, and well, there's just no way to tell these. And that might come out of, again, a particular kind of view of probability where we want to have, something more rigorous, like a repeatable experiment or something. I think it's true that we won't be able to determine exact values for the probabilities of different moral theories. We might be able to do that if we had like perfect insight and unlimited computational power, but we don't have those things. And so we're going to be using heuristics to some extent. We're going to be making judgments. And then when we do that, then other people can challenge us and they can say, well, you favor consequentialism over deontology because it's simpler. But actually, it's actually, consequentialism is actually kind of complicated in these ways. And then you give an argument. And so then, that might lead us to change our judgments about how probable these theories are. And, we have like intuitions about cases, and we say, well, what theory best explains those intuitions? And we can make judgments about how probable it is that we'd have these intuitions given different theories, and change our judgments about the probabilities of the theories based on those things. And in all of that, there's room for disagreement. There's room for arguments that could lead us to change our judgments. But I don't think those judgments are just arbitrary. Like there are some, there are clearly probabilities that'd be more reasonable to assign here, and probabilities that'd be less reasonable to assign. Like if I just say, the probability of there being anything other than consequences that matter is like, 1 in 10 to the 100. Well, that's not a reasonable place to start, I think. And so I think that there are like bounds of reasonability here. And maybe another thing to say is that for dialectical purposes, you don't need to agree on precise probabilities. You only need to agree on things like comparative probabilities and maybe lower or upper bounds for probabilities. So for example, if you're pressing the fine-tuning argument, your interlocutor, maybe you think that a particular moral theory starts off pretty probable, like 50%, and your interlocutor says, no, I find that like really implausible. And so you just ask them, well, how probable do you think it is? And maybe it's 1%, maybe it's 1 in 10,000. And then you can work with their probabilities. And you can both agree that it's at least that probable, right? Mm-hmm. So you agree on that much. And then you can come up with the conclusion. So theism is at least this probable when we look at the evidence and run through the calculation. So I think you can do those kinds of things even if you can't agree on precise probabilities, and even if we can't know what the precise probabilities are. And I would agree with the objection. We can't know what the precise probabilities are. But that doesn't mean that we're just totally out to sea.
Well, my thoughts on this objection were like, it doesn't really matter what axiology you use as long as your axiology has a non-zero probability. Like you could still use a comparative judgment, right? And theism's always going to have a claim over axiology, where naturalism is not, right? So even if it's
you need more than non-zero, because if the probability is so low, you can always make the probability low enough that then the fact that it predicts that you can always make the probability low enough that even after it's confirmed, the posterior probability is still extremely low. So you need the probability to start out.
That's still like a theistic prediction,
a non-trivial probability.
Even if it's a low yielding prediction, it's still a prediction, right?
That's right. Yeah, that's true. So if you're just trying to show that it's possible to assign probabilities and that theism makes predictions, then yes, then you can show that. If you're trying to argue that theism is probably true, or that its probability is
higher than that it's higher than naturalism, then you would have
to... right. Yeah. If you're trying to make one of those kinds of cases, then you do need to make assumptions beyond just the probability is some non-zero value.
Okay. Well, that's helpful. How much time do you have left?
I'm happy to keep talking.
Okay. I have I have one more question, maybe two. I was going to ask about miracles, but I don't know if we're going to get to that because that's a whole... Anyway, so my last question is, so I know Richard Swinburne, he argues in his book, God Incarnate, that God would do, atone for our sins and like become incarnate, and I feel like those are like axiological assumptions that he's bringing to the table, right?
Yeah.
So it seems like to me, like even there, it's like, okay, you have theism and the axiology. Well, if your axiology tells you like, hey, God must become incarnate for some reason, depending on what that is, then then there's a high probability that God would become incarnate. So I'm just curious if you think this kind of way of doing it not just has implications for natural theology, but also comparative religion as well.
Yeah, so that's another good example of certainly Swinburne's arguments in that area are another example of where you have these moral claims that make a difference to what theism predicts. And yeah, I guess that so you asked about comparative religion. I guess there are maybe two ways that you can approach that. One is in these questions about intrinsic probability, or the antecedent probability of different models of God or ultimate explanations, and the other is in how well confirmed these different theories are. For the former, there's like a common debate in Muslim Christian arguments is about the Trinity. And that's an example where like Muslims can make a pretty reasonable claim. I think that their conception of God is simpler than the Christian conception. Of course, you can understand the Trinity in many different ways. We don't need to get into that here, but plausibly on however you develop it, the Muslim conception of God is going to be simpler. And so you might think that the Muslim conception of God is intrinsically more probable than the Christian conception of God. And so you've got like those antecedent probabilities, and then you've got the predictions that different religions, or that those different, well, I guess the religions themselves make, they make particular historical claims about how God has acted in history. And then the question is how plausible those are. There's two questions, actually. There's the question of how antecedently plausible it is that God would act in those ways. And so that's going to be, again, a question that is answered prior to looking at the particular historical evidence. And then there's going to be a question of how well confirmed they are by the historical evidence that we have. And so with the former, maybe this is what you were getting at. With the former, then considerations like, oh, God would have reason to become incarnate because God would want to reveal himself to us and so on. That would be, if you buy that line of argument, then that would be an argument for the Christian conception of God over the Muslim conception, in that it would be an argument for that the incarnation would occur. I think, I think it's somewhat plausible, that thought. But, do I think the probability, like if we didn't have, if we were like thinking about this prior to looking at any historical evidence, or prior to knowing whether there's historical evidence for an incarnation, do I think it's like more probable than not that God would become incarnate? I'm not sure I do. So, maybe the probability is not like trivially low, and maybe it's a possibility it's worth taking seriously, because there are like some reasons to think that God would do this. But then I think really what that's going to do is to say, this is something that we should take seriously in, like, when we have a religion like Christianity that makes this claim. And then now let's look at the historical evidence. And that really is where I think the difference is going to come between Christianity and other religions, and that I think that the evidence for the historicity of the New Testament and the miracles of the New Testament, the resurrection and so on, are quite strong. And so I wouldn't rely myself so much, I think, on these antecedent probabilities, where maybe some other religions actually have advantages over Christianity. But I would say that the positive evidences the empirical evidences that we have for when we look at the historical record, that those support Christianity.
Right. So I guess this leads me to my last question, which is, what does this imply for debates about miracles? So like, let's use the resurrection just as an example. Because that's probably like the most popular one that people talk about. And like, so people typically like have this very, very, very low prior to miracles. And so like their arguments like something like, oh, well, we know miracles don't happen. And so like, it doesn't matter. Like, at least the historical data we have for the resurrection is not plausible. Like even if we have all this evidence, like it's still implausible that a miracle would occur. And like there, it seemed like I think Swinburne's route is probably the best way to go, because what he does is he raises the priors by arguing that God would do that. And so you think that like so what I'm saying is like it seems like the explanationism kind of would not just work for philosophy of religion, but also comparative religions and specifically miracle claims. Like, what's your thoughts on that kind of line of argument?
Yeah. So one way of arguing that the antecedent probability of miracles is very low is a kind of naive frequentism, which is to say, well, miracles are very rare, and so and you could take the Humean line, for example, that we've never observed a miracle. There's never been a miracle, and so then the probability of a miracle occurring in a particular case is very low. Now, putting it in that way is kind of question begging. It's kind of assuming what you're setting out to prove. But everybody will agree, Christians will agree, that miracles are very rare. I mean, Christians will disagree about how common they are, but I think we will all agree that they're rare, even if there's debates about like, do they still occur today and how commonly and so on. But the way to figure out is God likely to perform a miracle in this particular case is not to just look at like the total number of events and ask how many are miracles. Like that's that's ignoring a lot of information that we have. So if we look at the case of Jesus, we do have to assume like some background historical information, and we might have to make arguments with that about that with some skeptics. But like if we assume background historical information that like Jesus was a prophet, in the sense that he made claims about himself, and he made these moral proclamations, claimed to be sent from God, made prophecies about what would happen, and so on. These kinds of things make it more plausible that God would choose to raise Jesus from the dead, to validate his message. It's more probable that would happen than that God would raise like some random person who was not going out and preaching anything and was just generally uninteresting. Didn't have was not doing things that it would make any sense for God to raise him from the dead. Unless it was like in a particular context, like Jesus.
Right.
But just outside of that kind of context, or take another kind of example like that. Suppose that like somebody were to take a stick, like just not trying to make any point. Somebody's just like throwing a stick, and that God would choose to like make it levitate. Well, the probability of that's very low because there'd be no reason to do that, right? Whereas there are like plausible reasons that God would choose to raise Jesus from the dead. Now, again, the antecedent probability that God would become incarnate in Jesus, and that Jesus would be a prophet from God of some sort, and that God would validate his message by raising him from the dead, maybe that antecedent probability is still pretty low, but it's higher than the probability that like God would perform, this random miracle that doesn't have any conceivable purpose. And that's true, by the way, even if we're not assuming theism. We don't have to assume that theism is true. Like maybe maybe prior to looking at this particular case, the probability of theism is, let's say, 1%. Well, then the probability of a miracle in this case, is going to be the probability of theism times the probability that God would perform this miracle, given that theism is true. So it's going to be 1% times, whatever the probability is that God would do this miracle if God exists.
And that's just antecedent. That's just the prior. That's not even taking into account the actual data.
That's right. Yeah. And again, like those probabilities are going to be low, but they're not going to be as low as these like cases where, well, we just can't fathom any kind of reason that God would do that. And, so the fact that Jesus was this kind of figure that made these kinds of claims is a reason to take it seriously and to say like, okay, then we should look at this and see what does the evidence say. But, I think that without the particular evidence, that the probability would still be pretty low. And it's only after we look at that evidence that we say, oh, this probability, that God raised Jesus from the dead is very well confirmed. And so the probability that that happened ends up being quite high.
Yeah, because I mean, it just seems to me like in these resurrection debates, people just like they go by different priors, or like even in some cases, like skeptics will just kind of assume like that the case of Jesus applies the same as like just some random person, right? And it just seems
Right.
like
Yeah.
that wouldn't really work under this line of reasoning. So like I guess it seemed like to me like human arguments against miracles would be severely weakened in the case of Jesus. What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Hume. This is a point that I think is not usually appreciated when people are commenting on Hume on miracles, but I think Hume
Yeah.
was a kind of frequentist,
Yeah.
and so I think he had this kind of view of probability as just like that it's the number of times an event happens in a reference class, and so I think that that's why he comes up with the kind of view that he does. But yeah, I think that's the wrong way to think about probability. I think that clearly, like, we should take all of our information into account, and the probability of an event in one situation could be different from its probability in another situation.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you coming on, Nevin. It's been really fun. Sorry,
Yeah, thanks for having me.
sorry if I haven't been talking much, but like I just find this interesting. So, any final or anything like that? I don't have any more questions for you. I think I went through all of them.
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah, enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for having me on.
Okay. Thank you, Nevin. All right.
All right.
Sorry guys, I won't be able to. There is a few Q&As on the live stream, but I won't be able to answer those. Or yeah, we agreed to just answer my question. So I apologize if people want to ask Nevin a question. I won't be able to get to him on that. But anyways, have a nice day, guys.